Hi, I'm James Governor, co-founder of RedMonk, and we're here for another RedMonk Conversation. Today we've got with us Bill Higgins from IBM. Bill's got an interesting history with that company and in terms of changing IBM's development culture, and that's really what we're here to talk about today. So one of the themes that we've seen is sort of packaging up a lot of ideas from open source, bringing those together in a way that it's a new way of working for software companies and enterprises is inner source. Now, I think what's interesting is there's a lot of talk about inner source, but it's something that Bill has actually done at scale, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So, Bill, over to you. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Bill Higgins, and I work at IBM, where I'm a distinguished engineer and director of engineering for our foundational AI technologies. And I also advise the senior leadership team of IBM on how our development should change to create better software, to have higher levels of engagement, to have higher levels of diversity and inclusion. And so that's where the inner source really comes in.
Okay, awesome. So as I say, this has been a journey. One thing that's interesting, I think people don't necessarily realize, people are always thinking about, well, IBM is trying to sell its software, but IBM is also a huge consumer of some of these, like IBM as an enterprise has been very quick actually to adopting some of these technologies that we now consider a given in terms of modern software development. So can you talk a bit about that? Like, what were some of the platforms that you needed internally? And here's part of the reason I asked the question. Well, two reasons. One, the scale of what you're doing. And two, sometimes people are like, DevOps is a culture change. It's not about the platform. But of course, I believe, and part of what we've been talking about at RedMonk is that platforms can drive culture change. So what are some of the platforms you've been adopting? What does the scale look like? And has that helped you indeed change the IBM software development culture?
Right. So in the early 2010s, I became really interested in DevOps culture because as we were shifting from on-premises software only to a mix of on-premises and SaaS, of course, that was a huge struggle. And so I always try to look outward and find out who's best in the world at something. And one of the companies I found was Etsy, who, of course, in the early 2010s especially, was doing some really pioneering work with DevOps. And so I luckily had a friend from the blogosphere who worked there, Ray Coburn. And so I visited Etsy a couple times to see how they worked. And it really blew my mind. It just seemed like they were living in the future. And so I had this idea that if I could make IBM development operate more like Etsy, it would have a positively transformational effect. And so in the early 2010s, we did some kind of little DevOps tool change just for the projects I was working on. And they had some really good kind of localized success. So then in 2015, I got the opportunity to actually do a tool chain for the whole company, which had never happened in IBM's 105-year history, except for things like, email and stuff like that. And we had a fundamental choice to make. Did we want to kind of go with the obvious tools, like the enterprise tools of the world that were designed with IBM complexity in mind? Or should we go with the tools that people actually wanted to use, like the GitHubs, the Slacks, et cetera? And we chose the latter because, in my experience, you can't take a product that's not delightful and retroactively make it delightful, but you can take a product that's delightful and scale it in terms of number of users and complexity. But it was a major risk because back then there was no GitHub Enterprise SaaS, so we had to use the GitHub Enterprise appliance. And at the time, it was only qualified for 10,000 users. And we weren't even sure how many users we were going to have inside of IBM. It turned out that the population kind of topped out at about 75,000 people using GitHub. And then same thing with Slack. Like I remember the first time I talked to Stuart Butterfield and Cal Henderson from Slack, they couldn't imagine in 2014 running at IBM's complexity. And indeed, we had to work really closely on the design of Slack Enterprise Grid so that it could work with our complexity, both in terms of size, but also compliance requirements, et cetera. So we took some significant
risk. And that would have been considerably north, just out of interest on scale there for Slack, that would have been north of the 75,000, right? Because that was software developers. IBM is bigger than that. Like, I'm assuming Slack is used by everybody, or was that just for the development teams?
Originally, it was just for the development teams. But of course, a tool like Slack has a strong network effect. So pretty soon, if you want to talk to the developers, the product managers are in there. And soon everybody was in there. And I think it was maybe 2018 or 2019 that we decided to go all in with Slack as our enterprise messaging client. So now we've got, I think we still have the largest instance in the world. It's awesome. There's channels like our diversity and inclusion channel, which have 10,000 people in the channel who've just kind of opted in because they're interested in the topic.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And so is that, I mean, so IBM, let's see, I mean, you went up to above, like, within the last few years, I guess, up and around 300,000, but there has been some structural change. You know, do you have any idea? Like,
I think it's about 250,000.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a lot. So that's Slack, as part of the way that people are communicating. GitHub, that's something we all understand. What are some of the other platforms that were part of this transformation initiative that you're embarking on?
Those were certainly the two most important ones because those are the ones that end up being relevant to the most roles. But for some of the ones that are more kind of role specific, we a lot of people use Travis CI for continuous integration. Mm-hmm. A lot of people use PagerDuty for on-call. And another one, which isn't really a tool, but it's in some ways been equally important, is we got full access to the O'Reilly Safari media library. I think they renamed it the O'Reilly Learning Platform. But in some ways, that was just as important as GitHub because, of course, the rate of change in the industry, having access to the latest ideas is really valuable.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, tell me a bit about, so this argument I've made that a platform can drive a culture change. What did that look like? Or is that true? What did that look like in terms of your adoption of GitHub?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So it really followed the kind of the diffusion of innovations model with the adopter categories, like the early adopters, the early majority, et cetera. And the early adopters both opted into using the tools. Initially, we deliberately said, you don't have to use these tools because we wanted the signal about what was causing people to not opt in. Later on, our CEO, Arvind Krishna, said, no, everybody should use the tools. But the early adopters, the other interesting thing about them is that they use the tools right. And the later adopters actually struggled with the tools because they tried to graft on the practices from the prior tools onto the new tools. Mm-hmm. And the best example of that is with GitHub, the best practice is to not just like blast code into the main branch when you're done, but rather to create a pull request and then have one or more teammates do code reviews for a number of reasons. And when people first got GitHub, the people who weren't familiar with those more modern practices would just sort of like turn off pull requests and blast stuff into the main branch, which of course isn't awesome. And so what we realized is we actually had to, do some significant retraining about how to use the tools right, the modern practices. And as we did that, plus the power of the tools, we actually did see significant improvements for both productivity, but more importantly, engagement.
Okay, and how did you do that training? I think maybe that's something that people would like to know. How did you get the message across about pull request culture and what it meant, distributed development, and so on?
Yeah, I mean nothing kind of fancy. We basically just we got a corpus of training material that we thought was good, and then we basically worked with leaders in each of the group to basically bring the practices to their teams in an iterative manner. It doesn't work to just like send somebody to a class for a week and say, okay, learn a brand new set of practices that are different from how you've worked for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And so you really have to go kind of org by org, team by team to basically introduce them to the new practices. Sometimes there's some requirements to do it. But that's the way that we did it. It takes time though. It's not something you do overnight.
Okay. And so this inner source notion, like who else is doing it? Who have you learned from? Who have you taught? I mean, are any of your customers kind of asking the question? How can we learn from open source in terms of how we do our internal software development? Has that been an initiative that you've been involved in any way?
Yeah, it's funny. So one of the primary reasons that we rolled out those new tool chains beyond sort of enabling better practices was to make it much easier for IBM teams to work together. Like one of the inspirations was the Pixar building, where they deliberately design it so that people bump into each other to foster cross project and interdisciplinary collaboration. But what happened was, when we first rolled out GitHub, it actually caused that to happen, but within divisions. So like within the security division, they worked much better together. Within the data and AI division, they worked much better together. And that's basically because of, Conway's law, the way P&Ls are set up. It kind of drives certain optimization. So around 2019, we actually hadn't achieved the goal of getting people to work across divisions. So it was better, but it wasn't great. And then I actually switched jobs. So I then took on a different type of transformation job rather than rolling out new tools, because that was kind of on a success path. I took the job of being in charge of our foundational AI technology, because we had bought Red Hat in 2018 and that deal closed in 2019. And the person who's now our CEO, Arvind Krishna, put us down this new strategy of hybrid cloud and AI, where hybrid cloud deals with people needing to run workloads all over the place, data sovereignty, et cetera. But the AI part was really recognizing that AI should be a ubiquitous technology that should make any application better or any software product better. And so I got the mission to basically work with that same set of 75,000 IBM developers to basically infuse AI into our software products. And what we found was there was significant fragmentation of AI technology within IBM. So each division tended to have their own foundational stack of open source, IBM research, homegrown, et cetera. And what we realized was, if we were going to really succeed at infusing AI in all the products at scale, we would have to get to common stacks. And so we started a project in 2019 that at the time was called One NLP, for One Natural Language Processing Stack. It's now called Watson NLP. And basically, we set a goal of getting to a common stack for the company. Somebody at some point made this offhand comment that the only way you can get two IBM teams to work together is on an open source project. And some of our team members, the two key ones were Olivia Bujek, who was leading that One NLP from a management perspective, and Michaela Eller, who kind of did our development processes, discovered InnerSource. So there's a nonprofit organization called InnerSource Commons. It's innersourcecommons.org. And Denise Cooper and Claire Dillon have led that community to start to curate lessons learned and patterns and case studies from around the industries, from companies who'd already adopted InnerSource. And since at that time, Watson was almost wholly proprietary, now it's increasingly, we're going to open source more and more of it. But back then it was almost wholly proprietary. We said, well, maybe if open source gets IBMers to collaborate together, maybe InnerSource could get IBMers to collaborate on proprietary technologies. So we started to really look at the InnerSource Commons patterns, because of course, just being aware of a methodology doesn't guarantee success. Most attempts at a new methodology fail. We really tried to do it right, and we iterated. And by the middle, about 18 months later, we had that common NLP stack. And incredibly, from our perspective, it was adopted by 13 products in the first 18 months, which was just way faster adoption than people would have imagined. And so then we said, well, if it works for NLP, why shouldn't it work for any core AI technology? And so we've been doing that since about 2020 with a set of foundational building blocks that we're now about to commercialize, as I mentioned to you in the other talk. And then the thing I'm working with the senior team on is, okay, if it works for all of AI, why shouldn't it work for any of our core technologies like automation, data, hybrid cloud, quantum computing, security? So now we're trying to figure out how to operationalize InnerSource for any core technology that we both need to major on for our own products, but also bring to channel partners.
Awesome. Well, I mean, that's a big task to take on. That you've taken on some of these big transformations before. InnerSource as a first step to I guess the key word we always used to talk about this is reuse. So encouraging reuse at scale, and helping to drive your open source journey forward. Super interesting, Bill. Thanks very much. I think that that's a great take on InnerSource and where we are now. That's another RedMonk conversation. If this is something that you watching are interested in, let us know. Ask questions in the comments. If you've got something, I'm happy to route it to Bill. In English, I would say route it to Bill. But all in all, Bill, thanks very much for that update today. And to the rest of you, like I say, if you have any comments or questions, let us know. Have a great day. That's another RedMonk Conversation. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks so much.